Now on 4, Frank Field talks to Adam Raphael about political life.
Elected in 1979, I made my first priority to provide a service to my constituents which was second to none. I don't think there's anyone in the House of Commons that can say they give a better record to their constituents than I. It isn't a mystical thing. One of the great teachers for me now is my constituency. They tell me what's happening and whether what the government says is actually happening in real life at a grassroots level. And one doesn't want to actually lose that. I mean, one of the minuses of my political career is that because of the wrangling in the local Labour Party, it's about the only place that I don't actually learn anything, because positions are taken up and conflict is the order of the day.
What attracted you in the first instance to politics?
Quite simply that there's so many things in the world that could be changed. And I suppose lots of politicians really, and me included in this, are deep down busybodies who think they can do these things. And that was the attraction. I mean, the other side of it is that part of one's political life has been as a lobbyist, and therefore on the outside trying to get people to think really what one wants to happen is their ideas anyway. And then when I finally did get into the House of Commons, that we were in the long night of opposition, which is hopefully coming to an end. So it's been a very strange sort of setup of seeing objectives one could go for and real difficulties in achieving those.
I mean, arguably, you are too independent to be a convincing party politician. That is what has made your life so difficult. I think you said, for instance, that the last 3 manifestos were all nightmares, and you had to write them individually in your own constituency to be able to stand on anything you believed in. I mean, I wonder whether you recognise in yourself a streak which isn't that of a party politician.
I'm more than happy for you to press that. I'm certainly not going to help you to do that. Life's difficult enough as a politician without both of us joining the same side on this. It is true that this election will have the same election address, practically, that I've had for the last 3 elections. So it'll be the 4th time in Birkenhead. And it will be the first one, though, in which that coincides very strongly with the national manifesto. So there's a unity there. But if you want to present me as this schizophrenic person, let me help you. Because although I recognise that side, because I don't want to be there just for the sake of being there, and therefore it might make me difficult in some circumstances, I long to be on the inside. I long for the chance to be supporting a government, of carrying out a programme, some of which I've worked in detail about for 15, 20 years, of what needs to be done, what can be done, what's difficult to be done, where it's going to rub up against other areas of policy, and how does one coordinate all that together. I long for that period of time, but I don't just want it on any terms, and that's my contribution. And I'm sure it sometimes is perhaps rather difficult, but given the state of the play that we're in, that's it.
Let me ask you about some of the campaigns which you've been closely associated, both before your time in Parliament and also while you've been in Parliament. There's the whole of the child benefit campaign, the campaign to get proper compensation for those haemophiliacs who are infected with AIDS, and I suppose there's a whole campaign about the need to do something about the underclass. In presenting those campaigns, you've sought to go right across party. Do you think that has actually maximised your influence in the way you've pursued those campaigns, or do you believe actually now it might have been better to pursue a more perhaps party-oriented campaign?
The answer is without any doubt, yes, it was right to do that. But though I say that emphatically, it's not because I don't continually think whether it was the right and whether it's continually right to behave in that way. But if one looks at the underclass now, we've got a Britain that has been radically changed by Mrs. Thatcher. Lots of people are appreciably better off, and that's something which the Labour Party now thankfully has got to terms with. But the poor are now, the real poor, are a very small minority. There are lots of people hard-pressed and so on. I'm not making any bones about that. But those who've been cut adrift, which I would define as the underclass, do not now have common interests with the majority of what were used to be called, and what I'd still call, working class people. So their natural allies in the political process see themselves differently. So 40 years ago, I would have described Britain as a class system with, like a railway train, with first, second, third and fourth class carriages. And while people were allotted to their different carriages, the train was going in the same direction. What's happened in the last 10 years is that for much of the time, the train was speeded up. So growth was there for many people, but the last carriage was dehooked and is not actually heading in that same direction at all, or if it is, it's being pushed much more slowly. And the campaign is about how do you get other people who naturally promote their own interests to see that it's not totally wrong for them or against their own self-interest to have some concerns with the underclass. And therefore, one of the things I've been trying to do is always to point out where the common interest lies. Because I do not believe hiking child benefit around, the underclass around, haemophiliacs around, the long-term unemployed around. I don't believe just that sort of moral campaign, satisfying as it may be to the campaigners, does much good in the long run to those that you're campaigning with.
How important an influence is religion in your political views?
Very. And becomes more so, in that I think it's... I mean, I haven't had some wonderful conversion experience where, like Joan of Arc, I heard voices and one knows it's all right. To me, it's the most rational position to hold, in that it makes more sense than not holding a position as a Christian. That doesn't mean to say that most days I do not doubt whether the line that one holds is true. So I'm in a position of doubt most of the time, struggling to overcome that doubt. And I do so, usually most days, on the basis that this is a more rational position to hold than not to hold it. So I have none of that inner certainty that some Christians have, of having this wonderful personal experience with God. I have none of that. It's just a continual struggle, that it does make more sense at the end of the day to hold the position I hold than not to hold it.
But how does it affect your sort of political views? I mean, how directly does religion come into it? Many people would say the two things are totally divorced. Politics is the art of compromise, of expediency, of making alliances, while religion is about absolutes and faith.
It is about that, but it is also, I hope, has an attempt to try and see the best in an argument that is actually being put forward. It takes us back to points that you've said about how you do a campaign. Do you think truth is all on one side and evil all on the other side? Or are there points of agreement that can be built? That doesn't mean to say that you're not also a party politician wishing to promote one's own corner, and that is pile up the votes. I don't think you don't pile up the votes by not trying to listen to the other side and pick the best of their argument and weave it into one's own argument. But I do agree there is, in the sense, a sort of a side of the Christian faith which is about absolutes. But it is also how those absolutes are applied in everyday circumstances. And it, to me, the big effect it has, you might say, well, that's where your hair shirt comes in. It makes you very uncomfortable. I would say is that it helps me take a longer-term view, in that I'm old-fashioned enough to believe that there is such a thing as the last dreadful day of judgment. It's a phrase I've used already, and that we will be accountable for our time and our talents. And that helps me not to just look at tomorrow, at the headline, the newspaper coverage that one might get. But when I came into the Commons from Birkenhead, I thought, with a bit of luck, God willing, I'll be here for 30 years. Now, how do I spend those 30 years to the best of my talents and abilities? That's what I've set out about doing. And then if another 20 or 19 years' time, Adam, you'd like to run another series, you could ask me whether that was a success or failure, and I may be in a better position to answer it then. But it's certainly given me that time factor of accountability, of a use of talents, and that one mustn't just be too upset and blown about by the storm. There are other things involved as well.
How tough is the House of Commons as a sort of forum for a politician? Both as
I love the House of Commons, so you won't get a proper answer out of me. And I loathe those people and get immensely angry with people that come on programmes or get enormous fees to knock the House of Commons and so on. I think it's one of the nicest groups actually to be with. And there are lots of groups. I mean, it's lots of villages in the House of Commons, in the chamber, in the cafeterias, and all of those. There are different groups of, I think, village life that you can belong to and do belong to. And I know it isn't fashionable, but I think that the electorate doesn't do a bad job with the people that they elect. I know they love to moan about who they do get, and people say it serves you right, you get who you deserve. I don't hold that view. I'm amazed by the qualities that I see there, generally speaking. There are obviously some exceptions.
Because if the House of Commons has been a happy place for you, Birkenhead has undoubtedly been a battleground for 10 years. And I would have thought that was a most uncomfortable and bitter experience for you, to be confronted all the time with people sniping at you. How have you managed to deal with that?
There's a real difference. I mean, not with the town. I can't. First of all, I represent a proper place, and we all, people belong. We belong to Birkenhead, and we sense that. So it's not a bit of Liverpool or a bit of Birmingham or a bit of somewhere else. People actually belong to one place. And throughout these 11 years, particularly the last 8 years, there's been nothing but support from visual, from physical support of people saying of just keep going and what they actually want from their member. But that's different from some elements of local party. And I'm now through the worst of that, and I can talk about it, whereas before I couldn't. I don't now vomit with fear at having to face the party. I used to be in that position, and I'm not in that position. And I don't start dreading the next meeting as soon as a meeting is over, although I do obviously dread some of them, because it's a weird experience having 30 or 40 people who want to destroy you. It's very, very strange. A very important lesson about human nature. And whereas, again, at the last dreadful day of judgment, I won't have come out with a clean sheet of you didn't make any mistakes. It's easier to make mistakes if people want you to make them, rather than have a group of people who are there on your same side as you, rooting for you, wanting you to succeed for them and for the town. So I make a real big distinction. The town is a haven of support for me.
Speaking of mistakes, one of the things that is said about you, that you're impatient with the boring, rather squalid business of fixing votes, of fixing meetings, all the stuff of a politician who's in problems with his constituency. That area doesn't attract you, and you resent the time having to be spent doing it.
There's an element of truth in that, although it's always promoted by people who have the most lovely parties, who don't actually have to do this. So, I mean, I don't mind them being the Samaritans walking down on the other side of the road, saying, look at poor old Field squabbling over there. If only you knew how to squabble properly, it would be so much nicer for the rest of us. But they're absolutely right. More time ought to have been spent on that, and life would have been easier. But I don't find it a tasteful side to existence, and it's not one that I particularly want to cultivate.
The other thing that is said about you is that, and this is a quote, the trouble with Frank is he's a Benedictine in a parish badly in need of a Franciscan. Is it possible that you are in the wrong constituency?
The person that said that is now actually going to have a baptism of fire in the Walton by-election, and we'll see who takes to who in that, and I will be there supporting him in that. There is a real distinction what the town thinks in Birkenhead and what some of the Labour Party thinks. And maybe the party thinks I'm a Benedictine, but I would have thought the town views me as a Franciscan, at least in the way they approach me and the way they physically support me.
You described your opponents there in Birkenhead as thugs and Trotskyists. Is that really a fair description of the people who feel that you're not the right MP for the constituency?
It's not a fair description of the whole of the opposition, in that where I have failed is to hold on board people who I lost patience with, because I felt that to them it didn't matter as much as it mattered to me that we had a Labour government to start doing things which were important for Birkenhead. and that the very essence of what you described as the trade-off, which is the necessary interface between principle and power, which is where politicians are and have to be necessarily. It's an unpleasant grey area that most of us have to live out the whole of our lives in. And I certainly lost patience with a group of those, and I should have been more charitable.
You're about to stand again in a re-selection in your constituency. Is this the sort of the final act of this particular drama involving yourself?
Well, it's the final act of this round in that it's been going on for 8 years. But at the end of the month, there will be another vote, and it will be decided then who is going to be the official candidate for the election, yes.
If you are deselected, would you force a by-election?
No.
So that, and you've changed in that respect since the inquiry, since the look at the representation in the constituency, you have withdrawn that particular threat?
No, I withdrew it because I just collapsed. When the weekend after, following that weekend, I went in to see Neil Kinnock, and I went in to resign. I went in to call a by-election. And when I actually confronted him, and he confronted me, he didn't look well, to put it mildly. And I thought, and I've such sympathy with what he's been doing with the Labour Party, of dragging us to the point of wanting to win, I couldn't pull the trigger. And therefore that threat disappeared. And you can't have that threat and then put it up again. And it would look even more bizarre than one actually looked after making the threat and not carrying it out. But the reason I was firm to have it, but I didn't, not for anything that followed, but when I actually met Neil Kinnock, I couldn't actually say I was resigning.
Would you seek another constituency if you were deselected?
No, there's no other
Birkenhead?
place that I want to represent other than Birkenhead. I expect to be buried in Birkenhead. I expect to win this time and to continue seeing the Labour majority increase.
You list only one recreation in Who's Who, book collecting. You must have others.
Yes, I mean, I took some of them out, partly because I was less good at them as age takes hold of one's self. And also I was put off partly by the entries of lots of people who put these joke things in Who's Who, thinking it was so clever to put them in. But my father had a life of working as a labourer. I always said for 48 years. He's dead now, so he can't correct me on this. He always said I got the years wrong. And he knew what work was and what leisure was, because he hated work. And one of the great privileges of my life is I've not tried to dine out thinking that I'm hard-pressed and overburdened and underpaid. I'm none of those things, and I don't have this clear distinction between work and leisure. So although the day may begin early and end late, within that there will be activities going on, which, for example, a group of MPs may be invited to look at an art collection, and there'll be 20 of us doing that. Now, you'd have to be incredibly privileged to be able to buy that sort of standard of living, which comes by being a member of Parliament. So the whole of that side. So I switched from one thing to the other, never knowing, do I call this work or do I call it leisure? Because sometimes I would meet somebody that has an interest in Birkenhead on those trips, that might be placing a shipping order at some stage. And I try not to be too boring in bending their ear on those. But there is no clear division in my life. It's one of the great privileges of it.
Are there real friendships in politics?
Oh yes, I don't accept all this line that that you cannot have real friends there. And friendship may be lived out in a slightly different way because of the routine and the way we're stretched out in different places at different times and so on. But all through the day, I get a lift in actually seeing people, although I may not see them for another week, knowing what they do, what they stand for, what they're about. I mean, there are some other people that I don't, in the House of Commons, get that same feeling for. But that will be the same in any village, in any town, in any street. And it's there in the House of Commons because we are not separate from any other community, any other workplace, any other leisure centre. It's exactly the same. And experienced that and am part of that, just like anybody else.
You're not married. Is it not perhaps a rather lonely life at times?
Well, it's obviously lonely in that sense, but the life is actually quite important to me, in that I have no immediate family which would naturally get those affections which people have within them. They're, in a sense, more widely spread on my constituents. So I've never tried to hide that my constituents is very important to me, and I try and give them the best ever service, not because I'm parading around saying, look at Frank Field, look at the effort that he's doing. It's actually necessary to me, it's important to my stability. I hope they benefit as well as a result of that, but it's not a separate activity. And I realise that that side of my life is a diffuse side rather than a concentrated side. And at the that 30-year stage, when you have me back, we might actually look back at it and say whether it's worked or not worked.
When you look back at your career, both outside politics and also inside the House of Commons, what are the achievements that you're most proud of?
I haven't really got any, and I'm not saying that to be modest, because everything that I've been associated with could not have been achieved without other people simultaneously working to that end. And I'm not a person that looks back. When I've changed jobs, I almost never think about that past job. My efforts are, certainly at the moment, surviving as being member for Birkenhead, and I want that job for another 20 years. But looking at what my navel and looking back, I mean, I know I've been very quickly reflecting on some of the questions, and more importantly, some of the answers I've given to you over this half an hour. And I realised that it perhaps would be a strength if I looked more critically over what I was doing, that I could have answered more precisely where I'd gone wrong on things and where I'd been right. I play things much more by my gut, sensing things are wrong and matters are right. But my direction is usually, invariably, to the future and not to the past. So it is not through false modesty that I can't actually answer that question. It's that I don't ponder those things of the past. But if I did, you'd get an answer which would last the whole of the programme, saying, well, there was that, and that resulted in $1.5 billion extra going to children, but of course it couldn't have been done without the women's groups, it couldn't have been done without key people in the Labour Party, it couldn't have been done without the Tory opposition at that time. The Tory women were very important in that. Other people came on board, the trade unions, some of the trade union leaders at one point decided that they would play their card. Without all of that team playing, none of those things would have happened. So you're not going to get me going down on an ego trip.
Let's look at the future then. If there is a Labour government, would you hope to serve in a Labour cabinet?
I would love to be part of a Labour government, but that would not be up to me. That would be up to Neil Kinnock. Comes back to the point, I do not see myself as an outsider. And one would hope that the chairing of a select committee, of which I'm a minority party, but getting reports through, usually, which are of unanimous reports, show that I'm not this hair shirt guy that you talk of, but somebody who's very anxious to get a coat off and make sure something works and something is actually delivered. But I also understand that there have been difficulties in the past, and that may not be possible. And the one thing that I do hope, that as I support a Labour government from the back benches, I can be as pleased as I am now about people's success in the House of Commons, and that I don't actually become bitter. I prefer not to be part of the House of Commons, and this is the only time I would prefer not to be part of the House of Commons. If the price of that was to be excluded from the Labour government, I became very bitter because I wasn't part of it. I don't think that would be worth the effort.
Frank Field, thank you.
Next Sunday, Conservative Party Chairman Chris Patten explains his views at 4:25.